Alright, so this is the Reachback mechanics video as part of the mechanics series. Here I'm just trying to catalog a bunch of mechanics related to the Reachback so that I can refer to them in other videos. It's not meant to be a succinct tutorial on reaching back. Unfortunately, when recording this video, it started sprinkling on me, and so I started kind of rushing it, so it might be not as organized as I wanted it to be. I might redo it later. This is the second time I've redone it. So here I am the next day, just recording the intro. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about coiling a little bit and scapular protraction. And I have videos already on those topics, so I'll link them in the description down below. While you're down there, you can join the Discord. There'll be a link in there if you want to join in on discussion with other viewers, and there's a link to the Patreon if you're interested in form reviews, and links to other things I've referenced in this video. I think a lot of people have problems with their reach back because they don't know how to coil, and so I will talk about that in this video later. So changing the way that you view the reach back, I think, can help with a lot of issues that people have. And part of that is understanding coiling and feeling it as separate from the reach back. But everything is interconnected. So in a sense, the reach back is kind of part of coiling, because the purpose of the reach back is to get your arm more connected into your coiling tension and power, so that you're not just arming the disc. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to define the reach back as separate from coiling, so I can talk about it as a smaller piece. And so the reach back is going to be what you're doing with your arm separately from coiling. All right, so I will briefly define coiling and scapular protraction in this video. But go watch the others for a more detailed explanation. A great way to feel coiling is if I'm throwing this way, sitting down so that you can't pivot, and now just twist so that your chest is facing away from where you're throwing. That's mostly shoulder coiling. There's other parts of it that I explained in the coiling video. And then scapular protraction is with my arm raised up here. If I push my shoulder out away from my chest, that's what it feels like, and it's lengthening your arm. When you're doing scapular protraction, you want to make sure you're not shrugging your shoulder, so you're depressing your scapula as you do it. And then scapular retraction is the opposite. So scapular protraction is always going away from your chest, so wherever your chest is facing, it's that direction. So in the pocket, scapular protraction, going away like that. All right, so another term, shoulder flexion. This is neutral in terms of shoulder flexion, and shoulder flexion is this movement, moving your arm up in this direction. And you'd be familiar with elbow up in the pocket. That is, a lot of that is shoulder flexion, just for reference. And then this is external shoulder rotation, and then this is internal shoulder rotation. This is if I stop my shoulder from rotating. This is supination, and this is pronation. So palm up is supination, palm down is pronation. They go, the forearm and the shoulder can rotate in the same direction when the arm is extended, when the elbow is extended out like this. So when I do external rotation, my forearm wants to also do supination and pronation and internal rotation. All right, also horizontal collapse. What's the definition of that? This angle here with my shoulder to chest, I'm leaning over just so you can see it better. Right now it's at 90 degrees. When it gets less than 90 degrees, you start feeling your arm up here start touching your chest. That's called horizontal collapse. And we want to avoid it during the reach back and during the pull through, during the pocket, If you already have it in your reach back, then of course it's going to be a lot harder for it to not happen during your pull through in your pocket. So the reason I wanted to define shoulder flexion is so I could talk about reach back height in a less ambiguous way. So for example, I'm going to talk about reach back height as amount of shoulder flexion. So if I were to raise my arm up to shoulder height here, this makes a 90-degree angle from here to here, and so this would be 90 degrees of shoulder flexion. And then if I reduced the amount of shoulder flexion by a little bit, then my arm is more angled downwards instead of parallel with the ground, and so that would be a lower reach back height. So it's about the arm that's being changed here, separate from body posture, which can make it look like the arm is being lowered, but is not actually being lowered from the arm itself. So for example, 90 degrees of shoulder flexion here roughly, and if I now coil and now I hinge at my hips, it looks like I have a low reach back or lower reach back, but my arm has not changed the amount of shoulder flexion at all. And also if I side bend, we have, it still looks similar height, but then with some hip hinge looks lower. So these things make it kind of confusing when talking about reach back height, because people see a lot of pros look like they're reaching back low, and so they think, oh, I need to lower my arm. And sometimes you do need to lower your arm a little bit, but oftentimes what people are seeing is actually the overall posture making it look like the reach back is lower, instead of their low reach back being a consequence of a low amount of shoulder flexion. So when looking at pros in their reach back position, it's important to look at this angle here to try to see if they are actually having their arm in a low position, or if it's more their posture. A lot of times when I look at this, and it can be hard to tell from certain angles, I see that their arm is raised up, somewhere between like 75 to 90 degrees of shoulder flexion is really common, because that gets you to this power pocket around chest high or a little bit below chest high, or if you're Simon Lizotte, kind of in between belly button and the bottom of the chest. So he's in a lower kind of position there. So alternatively, if I maintain this 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, instead of hip hinging like this, if I lean back the other way, it can look like I have a high reach back, but my arm, again, I did not raise it. It's just the body position. So sometimes when you hear the advice, reach back lower, what people may actually be trying to correct is not how much shoulder flexion you have in your arm, but your body posture. You're leaning too much like this and need to lean more the other way. Because if you're leaning too much like this, then when you brace, you're likely to tip over your brace too much, and you're more likely to be pulling downwards into the ground and then having to swoop up and, nose up, air bounce, all that stuff. So adjusting the amount of shoulder flexion for reach back height can be useful, but generally you want to keep it consistent so your reach back and your pull through, your power pocket all feel the same to make you throw more consistently, and then use your body posture, for hyzer and hyzer and higher launch angle, lower launch angle, stuff like that to adjust the other angles. But in the extreme cases, when you're trying to throw really high or on a lot of hyzer, spike hyzers over trees, or rollers or a ton of anny, stuff like this, then you start needing some extra help instead of just changing your posture. And so then you might need to lower your arm reduce the shoulder flexion to give you easier access to a much steeper pull through for a higher launch angle. Scott Stokely has a video on this. I'll link in the description below. That is really good. He basically just says the same thing, keep everything the same and only change the arm height, shoulder flexion in those extreme cases. All right, so as I mentioned before, the main goal of the Reachback is getting your arm to feel more connected to your coiling tension and power so that your arm is being powered up with more of your whole body. And there's a great drill in my scapular protraction video where you can feel this more close to the power pocket / pull through position. But the main, in my opinion, source of how the arm gets connected to that coiling power is through scapular protraction. So you coil, you twist. So if I'm throwing this way, my feet are facing this way. Without turning my feet backwards, I'm gonna raise my arm to my shoulder to like around 90 degrees shoulder flexion. Make sure I'm not shrugging. And then I'm going to twist back so my chest is facing more backwards, extend my elbow. Now, scapular protraction. Get a little stretch in there and feel, you can feel how it's stretching here, and that's where I feel my arm is getting more connected into my coiling tension. So scapular protraction during the Reachback, I think, is the main power source of the Reachback. And some evidence for this is Blitz DG has a great video, I'll link in the description below, where he keeps his elbow bent the whole time as he reaches back and throws pretty hard, and he hit 69 miles per hour. He said he could probably get maybe another mile per hour there. That's a little bit above 90% of his total maximum speed. So the elbow, extending in the Reachback and then bending flexion into the pocket is not as big of a power source as many people think it is. But the scapular when you're reaching back without extending your elbow, you can still do that scapular protraction, get the and do all this coiling, so you can get most of your power still without extending the elbow in the Reachback. So the elbow, I think, distracts a lot of people in the Reachback. They're trying to, punch it back fast and get a lot of whippy stuff with it, acceleration, and they're missing scapular protraction and coiling for their power and timing, of course. And there are a number of other pros that we see who hit elite speeds without extending their elbow in the Reachback very much. Simon Lizotte, although at max power and before his elbow injury, he was extending it more. Calvin Heimberg, I don't know who else. I'm sure there's a dozen other examples. All right, so here's a way where changing the way you think about the Reachback a little bit and how you set up in your initial position, I think, can help quite a bit with getting into a better Reachback position. So if you start out kind of in this power pocket position with the elbow up around 90 degrees of shoulder flexion or a little bit lower, scapular protraction. So that part of the Reachback that I mentioned earlier, scapular protraction, is already largely done now. It's being preset, and the elbow height is already largely done. And this shoulder angle from here to here, we're not going to change it. So what is left for the Reachback? There's almost nothing left. So now you coil, if I'm throwing this way, coil, I haven't moved anything in my arm. Now all that's left is just extend the elbow, done. I'm in a good Reachback position. I didn't have to do anything complicated. Now, if you preset your scapular protraction, it's likely you're not gonna fully utilize that stretch since you're kind of presetting it. You haven't really fully felt the need for it yet. So I still would coil, extend the elbow, and as I'm extending the elbow,
kind of gradually, not jamming it back, not punching it back, extend the elbow and kind of get a little bit deeper scapular protraction stretch. So the reach back feels very simple when I think about it that way, because I also avoid reaching behind me, because this shoulder angle here is not changing. I'm just freezing everything in this position, coiling, and then extending the elbow, and the disc is away from my body. It's got this clear path if I'm throwing this way now to come into the power pocket. So that's why you need to learn coiling, to make sure that in your reach back, if I'm throwing this way, no, actually, let's do it this way. If I'm throwing this way and I don't coil and I try to reach back this way, the only way to do it is completely horizontally collapsing this shoulder angle here to try to get the disc back here. Now you're already starting with rounding before you've done anything else. If you're doing a short approach shot, you'll actually see pros, it looks like they're reaching out almost just completely sideways, because they're just doing a small coil and the shoulder angle doesn't change. So small coil and then into the pocket, low power approach shot. Bigger coil, didn't change anything in my arm, right? And I'm in a good reach back position now. The disc is away from my body. It's got this clear path. So the reason why it looks like people are reaching back is because they are gradually extending the elbow as they're coiling back. And so it looks like they're reaching backwards, but you're always reaching away from your chest, away from your body. You don't need to reach back. The back comes from twisting back, and the arm is just reaching away from the chest, and so now it looks like it's reaching backwards. So I did mention thinking about the reach back as a separate piece to coiling, but it can also help to think about the reach back as part of coiling, and you're coiling and kind of stretching things under tension, and at the same time you're doing that scapular protraction and gradually extending your elbow as well. And so it kind of feels like everything just kind of stretches slowly together, and in that way your reach back can be more controlled instead of, jamming it back there, which when you do that, if you reach back too fast with too much momentum, then that momentum has to go somewhere. You're probably going to finish your reach back early, but now you've got all this momentum, and your body doesn't want that momentum to just lock into your elbow joint. So what often happens is that momentum kind of translates into the arm raising up, your reach back floating up. Now you're going to be tempted to pull downwards because you're going to try to get back to where you think you should be pulling through, which is lower than where your arm is in the reach back. All right, so a little bit on reach back timing, but generally you hear the advice, and I agree, that you want the reach back to finish right as your brace is about to land. That way you're not reaching back too fast, out of control, too jerky, and then waiting around for your brace. And who knows what's going to happen if the longer you wait while the rest of your body's still moving, more likely something's going to happen, and you're going to lose your ideal position. So reach back finishing right as the brace finishes helps you stay kind of elastic and kind of springy, and helps with the control, like I said. But there are a lot of pros where their reach back finishes a little bit early, not in a bad way. And the way that I think you can recognize if it's bad or not is if your reach back finishes early and then it moves out of its ideal position, floats up, or you start pulling through too early because you're sitting around waiting for it, or as your brace lands, like you rush the pull through before you fully get braced. A lot of this stuff can happen when the reach back finishes too early. But if it's a little bit early, you can still maintain that elasticity and leave some play in the system to stretch it a little bit more while you're waiting for the brace to land in a way that's not detrimental, and you can still control the position of the reach back if you've reached back gradually with control. And when the way that I see this manifest is in what I call towing, which I heard from Seabass. So you'll see some pros finish the reach back a little bit early, and then you'll just see as their body continues to move forward towards the brace, the disc is just getting pulled with their body. It's moving. So the disc is kind of freezing in place initially as they're reaching back slow and controlled, stretching with coiling, but then it finishes early and now it gets towed a little bit with the body, and then the pull through starts. They're not rushing the pull through. So that towing to me is a sign that their reach back is controlled. Even though it's a little bit early, it's not overly early and losing control on where it is. So if you can focus, if your reach back is a little bit early, but you can focus on keeping it in a steady position and seeing this controlled towing effect happening, that can be an improvement. Like if I were to see two people with an early reach back and one of them I see is towing and the other one it's moving around, I'm going to be more concerned about the second one and not as concerned about the first one. So more on the towing analogy, kind of like if you reach back too fast, it's like you're towing something with slack, and then all of a sudden, boom, the slack runs out and you get all sorts of, rebound effects and lack of control. Or you let the slack out slowly and gradually, and now you can tow something with control without it bouncing around. Shoulder rotation in the reach back. I have to talk about the pull through for this to make sense, but in the reach back, if I have my shoulder flexion around 90 degrees here, this would be internally rotated in the reach back, more external rotation in the reach back. It's not necessarily a problem if you're externally rotated in the reach back. There are many pros, top distance throwing pros even, who externally rotate to some degree in the reach back, and the reason it's not a problem is because they're doing the other stuff right, and during the pull through, instead of pulling through like this, they are internally rotating the shoulder into the pull through, and then they get into a good power pocket position. And when you internally rotate your shoulder as your elbow is bending or bent, naturally the elbow wants to come up. So for some people who are externally rotated in the reach back, switching to a more internally rotated reach back can help them get to a better pocket more easily. But for many of those people, I think simply going to internal rotation in the reach back does not change this muscle memory of pulling through into external rotation, which then makes you want to dip the elbow. And the dipping and the raising of the elbow is shoulder flexion, but shoulder rotation, I think, is often the main driver for that dip or that raising, because it's just very natural. Your body naturally wants to stabilize your hand, and so if I don't change the height of my elbow with shoulder flexion, then the height of my hand changes dramatically, whereas if I allow the elbow to move, then my hand is more stably in this kind of location in space. So I think it's kind of more important during the pull through to just focus on learning to more strongly internally rotate to ensure that you get into a good power pocket position, and that will bring the elbow up on its own. But definitely try internally rotating more in the reach back in case it automatically helps, and that would then be easier if it does. Something else you'll notice a lot of pros doing is when they start coiling, you can see their elbow stays bent initially. So starting to coil, elbow still bent, now finishing coiling and extending the elbow and finishing the reach back. This helps in a couple ways. One of them, timing, of course, not rushing the reach back. But the other is if you finish reaching back too soon, and now as I coil, you can see my arm is sweeping like this with my body. And if I have my arm a little bit loose, that momentum is now swinging my arm into my chest, which is horizontal collapse when the upper arm here touches your chest. So if you do that, then you can end up horizontally collapsing before you've even begun your pull through. And of course, it's going to be a lot harder for your pull through in your pocket to not have horizontal collapse if you're already starting with it. So keeping the elbow bent initially as you start coiling and then extending it, you can feel everything in your reach back is going outwards, and you never feel this swinging in motion. So it's a lot easier to control that, I've felt, when keeping the elbow bent for the initial part of coiling. All right, so just to go over a couple styles I have noticed among pros of how they keep their elbow bent a little bit at the start of coiling, and then keep coiling and finish coiling as they extend the elbow and stretch the scapular protraction. First example is just doing nothing, just keeping the arm here with the elbow bent, starting the coil, and then the reach back happens a little bit after the coil starts. And this one to me feels like the hardest because doing nothing with the arm is really hard. It's very tempting to do something. Next one, having the off arm on the disc.
But keeping the off arm on the disc for too long is a problem that some amateurs have.
That can help, like reduce the urge to do something with your throwing arm, like starting the reach back right away. So coil a little bit and then take the off arm off and then start reaching back. Eagle McMahon would be an example of that one. I think David Wiggins maybe does it a little bit too. And then next is a pump. So usually the pump happens with the X step, pump the disc forward and out usually. And then as you start coiling, bring the disc back in, and now finish coiling as you bring the disc out. Paul Macbeth, classic example of that. A lot of people combine, initially having the off arm on the disc and then pumping it as well. And then another example would be Zach Nash, starting with the arm more stretched out. That one then has no pump typically, so it's just like this, holding it out, and then as you start to coil, bend the elbow, bring it in, and then as you finish coiling, reach it out. That one actually feels the most effective for me to not rush the reach back. It's not my main one. I've just been experimenting with it later. I'll drop a clip. But my main one is doing the pump and then trying to come back in before I reach back out. And the problem with it is it feels like I'm really doing it. It feels like I definitely pump, and then it feels like I'm really coming back in before I start the reach back, but it's just too easy to speed up and abbreviate that coming back in motion, especially as I'm running up faster and trying to throw faster, where everything, everything happens more quickly. So I then watch the footage and I'm like, it's like, oh, I barely I rushed that whole pump and back, and then I still reached back and finished the reach back too early. Whereas with the straight arm technique, just kind of feels like it's easier to not do anything with it and then just bend it here as I start to coil. And I see in footage when I've tried it that I'm delaying the reach back a lot more easily that way, it seems like.
It's hard to tell here at peak reach back how much shoulder flexion they have due to difference in posture and camera angle. For example, Eagle has lots of side bend in his coiling and hip hinge for hyzer, but it looks like to me it's all pretty close to that, like 80 to 90 degrees of shoulder flexion.